Astro is an amazing framework because it gives you the simplicity of just static HTML. However, you've got a bunch of power. For instance, we're going to create this button component in Astro where in addition to kind of the normal button things you can do, like passing in IDs, you can also pass in different props, like themes of primary, themes of secondary, whether or not it's filled, a bunch of other stuff. And you'll notice that then it outputs just like this. All this is happening because of this button Astro component. We're even going to add TypeScript at the very end so that you know exactly what you can use when you actually invoke the button itself. So if I come over here, I don't have to remember what my themes are. I can just come through here and I can look at it, and there you go. Now I've got a secondary theme available to me. And in addition to theming options, I'm also going to have size options. So we can have a small. Down here, I can have a large or the default medium. In addition to that, I could say whether or not it should be filled, which you can see over this way. I can also pass in various classes I may want to use. And finally, I can even spread in other things that are connected to the HTML element itself. So for instance, up here, you can see I'm extending the normal attributes off the button HTML element, and therefore I get access to all those things I can pass in. Now, this tutorial is meant for somebody who's either new to Astro or who's been writing Astro components for a little bit, but you're having a hard time extending them. It's not so much about buttons themselves, it's more about how you think about building out Astro components. Now, admittedly, this is a very simple example, and you may want to extend this and make it way richer. If so, let me know in the description what you've got. All right, you ready to jump in? Let's go. Hey, what's up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. All right, so here I've got my terminal open. I'm just going to type in npm create astro at latest. That'll work. And let's go ahead and call this like button component or something like that. One of the things I love about Astro is their great CLI tooling, so you get really great readouts as we go through this process. All right, so let's go ahead and just do an empty project right here, and I'll install the dependencies. And while you don't have to write in TypeScript, we will be using it later on in the project just to show you some of the benefits of it. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and do yes, and then I'll do strict, which is the recommended kind. I'll go ahead and also initialize a new Git repository as well. Okay, so all I have to do is cd into button component, and then I'm going to go ahead and open this up in VS Code. All right, hopefully you had a great go of that. You can see that I've got VS Code on the left, and I've got Chrome open on the right. I'm going to go ahead and open up my local terminal here and just type npm run dev, and that will spin up something at localhost 3000. And if I refresh over here, you'll see that this is what I've got here too. So let's go ahead and inspect the project really briefly, and then we will start styling out our component. Everything is just in this one pages directory since I'm starting with a very blank template, and you can see that if I add in here, it will live reload, which is great. So let's call this something like Astro Buttons. Now in this case, you can see that this pretty much is plain HTML. There's just really one thing that's being used here that's more templating in nature, and that is to actually pull in the astro.generator for the exact version of Astro I'm using here, and that will be output in HTML. If you're brand new to Astro, I'd encourage you to go watch my crash course on Astro. It's about 20 minutes and covers all the basics. And this, I really want to focus in on the actual components themselves and how to build out a really robust component. I'll show you several different options like I mentioned earlier, but as you can see here, what we're going to do is basically add extra content inside the body, and we'll be doing that by adding a component. Now, before we do too much, let's talk about why you might want to use components, and then we'll do some really basic styling for our CSS. So I've got this open over here, and you can see that in this case, let's say I've got a web page, and I've got all these little sections here that are actually reusable bits of code. Now, I might want to pass in certain props to them, like a new title or some more descriptions or text or an image or whatever, but basically they're reusable sections of code. And if you're writing one web page, that's not a big deal. But as soon as you have another web page, if I come over here, maybe I switch those things around. So now I have this one here, this one down here. So the power of components is that you don't have to basically re-hard code all these things. So I could grab this right here and say, hey, all of these, let's see, down here, I want this to be connected to this. And these are basically sharing the same code, but I might want to pass in different elements to it. So perhaps I have a title here, and they're different, but the underlying structure is the same. So it reduces the type of code you want to use or you need to use. Let's say also in this case that the designer comes back and they say, hey, for these two blocks, I want them to both be this color. Well, I can now just change it in one place and both of these components will update. So that's basically why you have components or reusable sections of code. So in this case, what we're going to want to do is create a special component for our button. Now, of course, because Astro is a superset of HTML, I could simply come in here and type in button and say like hi or something like that. And if I jump back over here, there you go, hi for my button. Now that works just fine, but I can't really pass in a bunch of custom stuff to this, like for instance, special text or an icon or whatever I might want to add. I can't do that over here because this is just an HTML button. So instead what I want to do is create an Astro button itself. So first of all, before we jump straight into that, let's go ahead and add some basic styling for the site. So I'm going to come over here and create a new file. I'll just type in styles / which creates a directory called styles. And then inside here, we'll have like main CSS. And then in here, we're going to do two very basic things, a basic clear to set all the box sizing to border box. And then we'll just set the font family to system UI. Now, in order to get this to show up, you have to come into some kind of template file or page file. In this case, I'm just going to do it on the one page we have, and I'll just import and then go up a level to my styles and then finally to my main CSS. And you can see that now this is updated here. Okay, so some very, very basic styling, I admit. Next, let's go ahead and add the basics of our Astro component. Now to do that, once again, this is by convention. I'm going to type in components / which will create a components directory. And then I'm going to type button. Now notice the capital B there, and then I'll do .astro. Now the reason I'm doing capital button is so that it doesn't get confused with the HTML element of button. Under the hood, this is basically still just a button. In fact, you can see it right here. And I could type in hi once again, and then just below here, I could start typing my button. And normally my extension will pull this in. In fact, let me show you the extension first. Right here, this Astro language support, it's a must-have for working with Astro. But you'll notice that normally it would pull it in, and I'm not getting that IntelliSense right now. So before I do too much more, I'm going to hit Command-Shift-P, and I'm going to type reload window. Sometimes VS Code just messes up, but now if I come in here, you'll see that I'm getting this as an option. If I hit Control and Spacebar, now if I click that, we'll actually import the button, the relative path here to the button. So I'm actually getting the button component, and it's being dropped in right here. Now if I save, you'll see that I have hi. Where is this coming from? Well, it's coming from this component right here, right here. Now you can actually pass things in like I mentioned earlier. So let's say we say, hey, I want to pass in my text here. And hopefully you've watched that crash course or are familiar enough with this. But the way you'd get this is just by getting this from the astro.props. Now you don't have to extract this out. You could actually come directly inside of here and say astro.props.text if you want to as well. And that will also work. That just means I need to come in here and type in text and say like hi. All right, now it pulls in that text because anything I pass in with this prop is being pulled in right here. Now, normally, like I said, you'd actually extract this out here. So all the values from astro.props come as an object, and you can just destructure that, in this case, text, and I can add it in right here. So I can pass in certain props and use those props in my special component. All right, so that's all the basics we're going to do when it comes to components. At this point, I'm going to assume you understand about basic props, how to pass things to and from components, how to use that. And now what we're going to do is start getting a little bit more advanced. I'm going to start by adding something called a slot. So instead of having to pass in this text, I can simply just have a slot right here. And this can be self-closing, or you can actually add some default content if you don't pass in a slot, like default right here, and it will pass in the default. If you don't have a slot is just to have a starting and closing here to your component and then add something in here. In that case, it's going to use hi. Otherwise, it would use my default. In this case, I'm not going to have a default for my button, so I'm just going to type slot like that, and that way I have to pass something in if I want anything to show up inside the actual button. So in this case, hi is showing up. If I don't pass anything in, nothing shows up, but what button would have nothing in it? All right, you can also pass in an icon the way we're setting this up as well, or you could pass in inside here, you could pass in a span that says hi, and maybe down here you could also pass in an image that has something as well. All right, so you could have an image and hi, or like an icon and whatever your text happens to be. In this case, just to show you that slot can contain multiple things, it just dumps in whatever you add right here. Okay, so that's the very first thing we're going to do. The second thing we're going to do is think through different variations of this button we might want. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and just comment this out for now, and let's just list out like things we might want in a button. Okay, so here we go. I might want to pass in the type. So this could be like a button, or it could be submit, for instance. I might also want to pass in the size. So I might want to say this could be small or medium or large. Let's see what else. I might also want to pass in like a theme. So this could be like a color theme. So like primary or secondary, whatever, that kind of thing. And then I could also pass in a Boolean. For instance, I might want to pass in something like is filled. All right, so is it filled or is it not filled? And then finally, I might want to pass in some classes. So these would be things that like may or may not show up. And as a last idea, in addition to the classes, I might want just some like button attributes that normally I could pass into buttons, things like IDs or whatever. So these are things I might want to pass in and have as options on this button. So let's go ahead and do it, first of all, without TypeScript, and then I'm going to show you the power of using TypeScript with Astro as well. First of all, let's actually add some better button text. So in this case, I don't want it to say hi. I might say something like click here, something like that. So now you can see that shows up over this way. Okay, so let's add these things kind of one at a time. First of all, I can add a type, and maybe I say, hey, I want it to just be button or submit. So I'll come in here, and I'm just going to add my type right here. Now, by adding these curly brackets, I'm essentially saying, hey, I'm passing in some kind of dynamic variable. Where am I getting that from? Well, I'm getting it from astro.props. So in this case, I might say type, and I can actually set a default for this. So let's say I say, hey, unless I pass it in as submit, I just want this to be button. All right, so if I come over here and I inspect this, now you can see that I have type of button. I could also come over here, and if I want to override that, I could add in type, and in this case, I could say submit, and when I save it, you'll see that now it says type of submit. All right, so that's the first thing down. Let's now think about the sizing. Now, there are a bunch of different ways you could do this. You could add a class, and you could have different classes like small, medium, large, whatever you want it to be. Or what I typically like to do is control things like sizing or color or things like that on data properties. So I could pass in data, and then maybe we could call this data size. In this case, this could be the size that I pass in. Now, once again, I'm saying this is dynamic. It doesn't know where this is coming from yet. So I could come over here and say, hey, I'm going to pass in a size. And once again, I may want to pass in a default. So maybe I say, hey, medium should be my default. Now, when I save this, you see data size equals medium. Now, so far, this isn't doing anything, but we are actually getting it to show up on the button itself. Next, we have the theme. Now, these could be a variety of theme colors, but let's say I came over here to my main CSS, because usually this is in the scope of a broader project, not just a single button on a page. And let's say I had a variety of theme options to choose from. So in this case, I would probably declare something on the root and maybe have a bunch of different CSS variables like primary, secondary, success, danger, warning, etc. All right, now remember, anything you've imported here to the main file, all the children here, including Astro components, get all those CSS things. So the classes, they get the CSS variables, and so I've got all that available to me here in the button component. Now there are a bunch of different ways we can use this. So for now, what I'm going to do is bypass this and come back as kind of the final thing we do in this list. And then we'll optimize this in a second, because this is going to be a little bit more complex. Okay, so let's go next to the isFilled. Now I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add some classes here. And there's a couple different things you can do. You can just add in classes like this, and I could actually interpolate values directly in here. So I could add like size, and that would add that class. If I put this in backticks like this, so that's something you can do. However, there's another cool feature in Astro, and that is something called a class list. It's a utility to provide a list of classes, as you can see, and essentially you put it in template strings. It's an array of different things. You can do sets, you can do maps, you can do strings, you can do objects. Any of these things can be passed in, and it will basically grab those and add them to your class list. So in this case, I could have a default set. So I could say like default or button large or whatever I happen to say. And anything I pass in here, you'll notice just gets passed on. I can also have objects. So I could say something like add the class filled if isFilled is equal to true. Or in this case, I can just say if isFilled is there. So if isFilled is here, which I need to actually get from Astro props right here, you can see if it is there, then go ahead and pass it in. In this case, it's not there. So I could come back over this way and I could add that. And we could say, is this equal to true? Actually, I could just leave it like that because it's a truthy statement. If I come back over here, you're going to see it's added this class of filled down this way because isFilled is true. Now, I could also, of course, pass this in and say that it is equal to true like this, or I could say false, and then it would not be true and it wouldn't add it. So, but just adding it itself makes it now true. All right, it's truthy, it's actually there, it's available to me in this individual instance of the component. All right, so this class list is super helpful for things like that. In this case, I don't actually have default classes, but I will go ahead and just pass in classes like this. The classes is going to be another thing I add. So like this, we'll have some classes, and these are optional. So if I pass in any classes, they will basically just be passed on here. So I could come back over here, and I could add like classes, and just say like large, pink, orange, I don't know, whatever classes I might want to add, and you see that they just get passed on. So this is going to be an optional prop that we may use later on just to kind of show you the power of passing in classes and adding them to a list of other available classes here as well. Okay, so we've done 1, we've done 2, we've now done 4. This is a Boolean that will or will not show up based on whether or not this is visible. We've also passed in different classes that we may want to have. So if I want to add in additional classes, I can spread those right in here and they will just be added to my final declaration here, class equals whatever it happens to be. Now the last thing is I may want some button attributes. So what I can do is come back over this way, and let's say I had something like a tab index. And maybe I say something like tab index needs to be equal to 0. All right, so right here you see it's not actually coming through. And the reason is because I need to grab anything else that I could pass in, and I can simply declare this as rest. Now by saying ... rest, what it's doing is it's spreading all of those in. So essentially I'm saying anything else I pass to the button component, my official button component, I want you to just spread in as additional options. Now how do I get those here? Well, this would be outside of the class list. It's not going to be inside my data size, or it's not going to be inside the type, certainly. All I'm going to do here is come over here and say rest like that. Now, if I look down here, you're going to see that the tab index equals 0 has been passed on as essentially another attribute. Now, because I said I was going to be using TypeScript, if I come back over here, sometimes you'll get an error here because it doesn't yet know what the props are. We'll fix that in a second if that's the case for you. In this case, if I remove it, here you'll see that that's what shows up. If I say ID equals like yo or something like that, now that prop or the attribute also gets passed along just like that because I'm spreading in anything else that I haven't predefined in, and it's just going to add it to that front button tag right on the front of the actual rendered HTML. Okay, so I promised a few things, and that is if we come back over this way, I promised to look at this color theme. Before I do that, let's go ahead and style this a little bit because we can't really do a whole lot with the color until we've got some styling. Now, you've got several options with Astro when it comes to styling. In this case, I'm going to locally scope styles just for this button to this exact component, so I always know where to find the styles here. Let's grab the actual HTML button tag itself. In this case, it's going to be scoped to this exact component, so that's no problem at all. And let's set up some basic resets. So here I'm going to say that the font needs to inherit. This would be from the body. And then I want the cursor to be a pointer. So now if I come over here, you'll see the font change. Now I get a cursor, and that's only inside of this component. So if I use a button anywhere else in the project, it would also need these same resets. But if I always use my button component, then I've got all my styles available to me. The next thing I may want to do is set up some variables. Now what I'm going to do is scope some local variables here. We're going to call them background, and we'll add that in a second, and we'll also add this as color. Now what I want to do is number 3 right here, where we're going to pass in a certain theme, and that theme will basically allow us to choose from one of these colors right here. So I can come over here and maybe say something like theme, and I might pass in something. Let's come over here and say theme is equal to like primary. Now how do I get this, the theme primary, to be used as a CSS variable inside of here? Because it kind of depends on what it is. I can't do like interpolated values down here in the CSS. So how do I get it down here? Astro allows you to define variables in your front matter and pass those on to your style tags. So if I come over here, let's say up top, right below my props, we're going to define 2 variables. We'll have background, and then I'm also going to have foreground. Now this first one is going to just be a template literal string. I'm going to simply set it as a string of variable equals whatever my theme happens to be. So if I pass in theme primary, then this would be my variable of primary. And this will actually be able to grab from my global CSS file that we already imported. Now if I jump back over to my main CSS file, for this and this and this and this and this and this and this, I can use like my background, my light text. But if I pass in light, I want to use my dark. So we can do, once again, a little bit of JavaScript over here. So I can say, hey, if my theme is equal to light, then I want foreground to be equal to var primary. Otherwise, I want this to be equal to var of light. All right, I'm still getting some errors because this is not how you write variables. All right, there we go. So now I've got a background and a foreground variable, and I could console log these. So there's my background, there's my foreground. If I come over here, you know what? I need to actually pull up the dev server. You can see I'm getting primary and secondary. So all this up here is written on the server, or is console logged on the server. All this is client side. All right, so let's get rid of this right here. Now that we know what we're getting back, what I'm going to do is pass in one of those themes. Let's come back over here to index. We're going to say theme primary right here, just making sure that that is set. Okay, so with that set, I'm basically saying, hey, if the theme is light, which it's not, but give me this primary as the color. Otherwise, let the color of the text be light. So let's actually use this now in our style tag. You might remember I said you can pass down CSS variables to style tags in Astro. And the way you do that is with something called define vars. You'll pass this in as an object, and I'm going to say, hey, this object has two things in it, has foreground, and it also has background. Now, where is it getting this? From right up here. So I've defined this, and I'm basically saying, hey, now these are going to be available down this way. So finally, here we go. Down this way, what we're going to do is say that this should be the background. I'm defining it up here, and this is basically dependent on what I pass in. That now gets passed in as a string down this way, which is then used right here. We'll do the same thing here. We're going to say var foreground, but I've yet to actually use it in the button itself. So let's go ahead and set up some default styles where we'll use those. So default styles, we'll say background color is equal to, now we can do this in a couple different ways. I can pass in a default color up top here, or I say, hey, if they don't pass in a theme, go ahead and make my theme whatever it happens to be. So that's one option. So I could come over here and say, maybe I want it to be light by default. All right, so if that's the case, I can come down here and just say that this should be var background. Now, why is this showing up as primary? Well, that's because that's actually how I defined it. But if I get rid of this right here, you can see that now it's that light color, that white color. Let's go ahead and put that back though. I'll come over here. The other thing I can do is set the color now to var of color. Now, why is it this white color? Well, you might remember if I come up here, if it's not light, it's going to use this light color. So however, if I remove this here, or I can just change it to light, either way, it's going to use the default of light, and the color will now be the primary one right here. All right, so let's put that back. The other thing we could have done is we could just define this with the CSS variable itself, but just to keep it cleaner, I'm just going to keep stuff scoped right here. Now, the other thing I might want to do is have a border as well. So by default, I might say something like 0.2 em, solid, var, and background. So there you go. You now have a border, and it's colored based on whatever it happens to be. Now, we will switch this up in just a second here, but for now, I want to go ahead and just add one more thing, which is padding 0.4 em, and then we'll do 1.25 em. Now, the reason I'm using ems is because we're going to change the size of everything based on this data size attribute. This size will then just adjust the font size, and because I'm using ems here, these are relative to the font. So as I change the font size, the padding itself will increase or shrink based on the font size itself. So I don't have to redefine that in a bunch of different places. I can define it once here and be set and ready to go. So speaking of those data sizes, let's go ahead and add that. So I'm going to say data size, and we have three options. We have data size small. And here I might say something like, I don't know, let's do like 14 pixels. And we will also have a medium, and we'll also have a large. Now you can also make these things like rems if you want to as well. So I could say like 0.8 rem, and then maybe let's say 1.1 rem, and finally like 1.5 rem. Now you might remember that I have a default on here of medium. If I come back over here, data size medium, but I could change that as well. So now if I come over here and I have size, and I set this equal to large, you'll notice that only does the font size change, but the padding also increases dynamically based on the font size. The font size is here because I'm using ems. Both the border and the padding dynamically adjust to the font size that I pass in. Now, there are a couple other options as well. So if I come over here, I don't have to use primary. I could use like danger, all right? And then it passes in that red color. Now, all this is happening because inside here, I'm defining the variables right here that I'm getting from right here based on whatever theme I've passed in. So now we've done all of these things. We've got our type, we've got our size, we've got our theme, we've got isFilled. We have yet to do that, I guess. So we still need to do that. Classes, button attribute. So I actually have isFilled showing up or not showing, but we've yet to do anything with this. So let's go ahead and do that next, and then we'll actually customize this a bit. And finally, we'll look into using TypeScript. So I'm going to come down here and say, hey, let's grab the button itself. If it also has the class of filled on it, then I'm going to set the background color here to my var of background. Now you might say, hey, didn't you just do this up here? And you're right, I did, which means probably what I want to do here is actually set this to light. Now before I made a point of like staying here locally scoped, but in this case, because I don't want it, I want it to be like bordered by default and then only filled if I pass that in. In this case, I think this is the best use case. That also means here, I want to set the border to none if I have it filled. So let's come back over here. isFilled is there. If I remove this, it should now be bordered. Now the other trouble is now the color itself is still that white color. Well, why is that? Well, that's because I set it up right here as the default that basically it should use the same color. So number one, I want to go ahead and move this down here so that that's the case if it is filled. And here I want to change this to be equal to my background. That means if it's not filled, like in this case, it's going to actually use the same color for the border as it does here for the color. And then the default will be to set the background as a light color. Now, if I come over here and I add back in isFilled, you can see that now it's actually using that color. If I come over here, what it's doing is it's overriding everything and saying, hey, now I want to use the background color. I want to use the text color of color and then remove the border altogether. So let me add a few other things and we'll walk back through this one more time. Next, I want to make sure that when I come over here and I focus on it, so if I have a focus state, so like right here, you can see I get this default like blue border from the browser. I just want to set the outline color to transparent because I want to provide my own based on the color of the button itself. Before we do that though, let's go ahead and add a hover state as well. So I could say like opacity is 0.8. And maybe I want to add a scale property as well of 1.05. You can now add these transform things like scale and translate and all this kind of stuff without having transform, whatever the thing happens to be. So that's why I'm doing it here. It's not totally supported everywhere like in older browsers. So you may want to backfill this, but for now, we're just going to leave it just like that. Next, I want to add a button of focus visible. Now this is where we're going to tab to it and add our own custom tabbing state. You can see that this is our hover effect. For our focus visible, I just want to add a box shadow. Here I want to have a ring of 0 left and right, 0 up and down, 0 blur. We're just going to do 0.1 Once again, this will be variable based on that font size of our light. And then to make it ringed, I can come in here and add one more where we say background. Now, if I want it to be ringed around it, I need to make it a little bit bigger so it sticks out from behind it. So if I now tab to it, you'll see that the internal ring here is this light color, and the external ring is the whatever the theme color happens to be. All right, lastly, let's go ahead and add some transitioning here. So transition, we'll do box shadow, should be like 0.2 seconds. And we'll do a cubic Bezier curve. Let's do this one right here. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy this a few times, add commas in between them. We'll change this out as well. So I could say like opacity. And here I might also want to say something like scale. Now, if you don't want to declare this multiple times, you can just do all 2.2 seconds cubic Bezier. That works as well. But now you can see how these things are a little bit more fluid. They kind of pop in and out as I tab to them or come over this way. So we've got all these things available to us. And now we're using the button itself, the type of button, the size, I can change that, the color theme, I can do whether or not it's filled, I can also pass my own custom classes or actually use this button attribute. In other words, any attributes I can pass into a normal button prop, I can pass in right here and they will be spread in. The only thing we haven't used yet, even though it's set up, is this classes prop. So let's come over here and let's go ahead and add in like classes, and I'm going to add something like cool. All right, something like that. And let's say that this is defined over here in my main CSS. So I could say cool is like, let's say background color of yellow. Now, this is not something I would personally do. I would like to contain all the styles to the button. I just want to show you how you can use this because there are lots of other components that are not buttons where you may want to pass in classes. So if I come back over this way, this is being passed in here. In fact, cool, right down there. However, it's not being applied. Why is that? Well, let's come in here and let's click on this and look at the styles. So you'll notice it is actually coming in here, but it's being overwritten here. Now, the reason this is happening is that even though Astro is adding this where and scoping it to the actual component itself, it's actually beating the specificity because I have a class in addition to my button tag. So I can change this in a couple of ways, but probably the best thing to do is to come in here and anytime you have like a special class that's adding to the specificity, you can actually wrap it yourself in a where like this. What where will do is it will basically have this as the minimum specificity, in this case 0 right here, so you can override this anywhere, which is why Astro scopes their stuff like that. The only reason it didn't actually work is because I added some extra specificity myself. In fact, if I remove this, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Back over here, this is all wrapped in their little where specificity, but I tacked on the end a higher specificity than a simple class itself. So if I put that back, now you'll see it actually overrides my settings in the button itself. So just be careful when you're passing in classes. If you have scoped stuff here, you just want to make sure that things are being applied as you want them to be applied. Now in this case, if I actually remove this, so let's get rid of classes cool right here, you'll notice that now my isFilled is not actually working. So again, you've got to pay attention to how you're doing this. Because I've got this wrapped in a where selector, I also need to wrap this right here in a where selector. So depending on how you're doing stuff, it can get kind of hairy. So generally speaking, that's why I like to scope all of my things directly right here. And then anything where I'm being more specific, I just wrap it in a where selector. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and remove both of those just to show you that you can basically interact with outside CSS and other components that are passed down, but I typically like to contain everything right here. But there are a couple gotchas there. Okay, so we've got a bunch of different things we can customize. If I come back over here, we can remove is filled. We can set this to like secondary or primary or whatever I want it to be. And all the scope styles, including like the rings and all this kind of stuff, are just dynamic. They adjust for me. I could also come in here and add in medium. I could add in small, and I don't actually need anything but a theme. And you can actually adjust this even if you want to make it more dynamic. But in this case, I would need to have some kind of theme to set up what this is. But all the other props are essentially optional. In other words, I don't have to actually pass in a button type because by default it's button. I don't have to pass in a size because by default it's medium. I don't have to pass in is filled because it will be false by default and everything adjusts. I don't have to pass in a theme, etc., etc. Classes, rest, all this. Now, one note, you might be saying, okay, this is a button. How do I interact with it with JavaScript? Do I write the JavaScript here in the component or do I write it out here? Now, in this case, the button is basically going to be used all throughout. And each time I click the button, I want the page itself, wherever it's at, to define what should happen. So in this case, what I would want to do is use that ID that I can pass in. Remember, that's part of that REST spread props. I could say like button 1 or something like that. I'd actually want to define everything here inside of a script. So I could say like button equals document.querySelector, and I want to grab something with button 1. Then I could just say, actually, let's just do it right off the back of that. So I could add an event listener, and I could say it's a click. And whenever I click, let's just do this inline. I want to say alert, yo. All right, so now if I come in here and I click, it should say yo. Now, the reason I'm doing it here is because I don't want to define it in the button component, or every single button would have the exact same response. So every time I click on it, it would do the exact same thing. So in this case, I can kind of keep the styling and the actual content to the component, while I can use client-side JavaScript here in my page, wherever I happen to use it, to define what that button click should do. That's one of the reasons I wanted to show you how to use this with a button instead of doing other components, because it involves JavaScript, it involves CSS, it involves HTML. Okay, lastly but not leastly, let's go ahead and enhance this with TypeScript. I'm going to come over this way, and if you've not used TypeScript before, we're going to keep this fairly basic. But basically what I want to do is tell myself when I'm over here what I can include. Because if I come over here and I start typing, I don't know what I can include and not. I have to constantly go look back here at this Astro component, which is kind of a pain in the neck. Now, because I set up the project to start with TypeScript enabled, now I can simply add this. So I could do it like this, type props, and then I could just define all those props. That's one thing I can do. However, because I want these REST to be associated with the actual HTML button tag, Astro gives me a help there. But I have to extend off of an interface. And one of the differences between types and interfaces in TypeScript is that you can extend interfaces to add certain things to them. In this case, what I want to do is I want to add this as an interface. And I want to say interface props extends HTML attributes. If I start to type this, you'll see I get Astro/types. And if I click this, it pulls it in. Basically, Astro gives you helpers so you can say, hey, I want to pass in. This is like almost like a function in TypeScript where you're passing in here to this generic what type of attribute or what type of element you want to grab the attributes off of. So what I'm saying is, hey, whatever props I get, they should also include anything that's available on a button, the HTML element of button. So now I'm simply going to grab this right here and drop these in here just as a starting point. And I'm just going to start to define these. So I can say type can be equal to button, or it can be equal to submit. Now in TypeScript, the way you define one option or another is with this union type. So I can say it needs to be a type of button or a type of submit. So these are the only two things allowed. Now these are going to yell at me for now, so let's go ahead and comment this out. You also notice though, one thing I need to do is I actually need to set this as an optional item. Now it's optional because I'm already passing it in down here, but in TypeScript, you can do that with this question mark. So I say, hey, you don't have to do this. If you look down this way, you'll notice that this no longer has a red line under it because I've actually defined this in the props. So we need to do the same thing with each of these. So I'm going to say size, once again, does not have to be there because I'm giving it medium by default. But just like you saw up above, I can say, hey, I need one of these options. In this case, it's small, medium, or large. And now that second one goes away. Is filled. Now this is a Boolean, but once again, it's optional. So I can simply say Boolean like this, and that's an optional thing. Next, I've got my theme, and this can be any of these right here. So let's go ahead and just copy these like that. I'll come back over here and paste these in. Now in this case, let's go ahead and grab this first one, hit Command D a bunch of times. We'll get rid of all those. And using the power of multiple cursors, let's go ahead and add in all the rest of these as options. All right, it's done some reformatting for me, but you can see I'm saying, hey, this is optional, and here are the different options available to me. Same kind of thing as up here. Finally, I've got classes here, and this would be also optional, and this is a string. Now, why did we go through all the pain of this? Well, that's because we can now come over here. And when I start to type, I can just hit Control and the space bar, and it now shows me everything available to me. So if I start to type, you see that type shows up there as one of my options. You can see I've got button, submit, or undefined. Now, the reason it's added undefined here is because it's an optional prop, and it's optional because by default, it's already set to, let's see, button right here. If I come back over this way, here's where the real power comes with something like the theme. I don't remember what my theme variables are, but if I simply just hit Control and spacebar, you see that I've got them all available to me. So like success, and suddenly everything is here. Same thing here, I can come in with is filled. I'm trying to remember what it's called. There it is right there. I see a Boolean, and I could just add it on there, and now it's filled, and that's working just great. So TypeScript basically makes it to where I don't have to constantly flip back and forth between my actual component to see what I can pass in. I just hit Control and spacebar, and I can see those things directly as I type. Remember, because we've extended these HTML attributes, I can come in here and add in anything that would be available on the button HTML attribute. So if I start to type tab index, you see that it actually gives me the options, a string, a number, null, or undefined. So I can pass in 0, and now if I come over here, you can see that I'm now getting tab index equals 0. And it knows what I can pass in and what I can't pass in because it knows that this is an HTML button. Now, there are so many more things you could do to this button component to make it even more robust, more flexible. So I'd love to see what you come up with. For instance, adding like an icon as an option and how you might style that. I'll give you a hint. What I would do is come in here and under my default styles, I would probably set this as a display of flex and gap of like 0.2 em. And again, that would be flexible based on the size of the text. And that way these things would be set next to each other if I passed in an icon. I'd probably also do align items center. Here I am doing what I said I wouldn't do. But now you can see that if I were to come in here and add two things inside of here, maybe it's just a span. And I say click here, and maybe I duplicate the span. So let me grab this, and I could duplicate it and perhaps search for something. Let's say like an arrow, and let's just look at other symbols. Like that. Now you can see these things are next to each other and they're spanned in the aligned center as well. So that might be another thing you could do if you want to, but I will leave that to you since I just did it. But there are a bunch of other things you could do. So if you have other suggestions for how to make this even more robust, better, let me know. But this was never really about buttons. It was always about understanding how to pass in things to a component in Astro and the different options available to you. Whether that be things like defining variables, spreading and rest props, using the class list, or even using TypeScript itself and extending off an HTML element. I hope this was a big help. I will catch you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Happy coding.